Okay. So we need to finish talking about corporate culture and then talk about the meaning and value of work. And then next week, we will not meet because you will be working on the second exam. So you have, so you have that time, you have class time basically to work on the exam. So we will not meet. So if you're disappointed by that, you let me know, you give me a call, and I'll be happy to talk to you calmly and softly. I've never had anybody do that, but just in case, if you just absolutely feel that we need to have a conversation, you're welcome to do that. If you have any questions about the exam, obviously you should give me a call. So you'll have a week, it'll open on Tuesday, and that's why we're not meeting on Tuesday, and then you'll have until the following Tuesday to complete it. And it will cover the things that we've talked about in the second module. The exams are not, one of the questions that students ask is, are they comprehensive? They're not comprehensive, but they are sort of cumulative in that you can't dump theory and not use theory on the second exam on the essay question. And again, on the essay question, these are long essay questions that should have a thesis statement followed by substantive examples that support the thesis statement and reach a well-rounded conclusion. If you're typing less than 750 words, probably not hitting all of the points that you need to get. So we talked about whether or not culture was something that formed from the bottom up or the top down. And I said it kind of depended on the organization and how long the organization has been around. I used UCO as an example. One of the things that makes it very difficult to have top-down cultural change at an institution like UCO is that it's been here a long time. There are things like tenure protection that guarantee that we have things like joint faculty administration governance, or shared governance is what it's called. And so the organization's age and its history play a lot as to whether or not you have a top-down or a bottom-up sort of approach to culture. If you want to create an ethical climate, one of the things that you have to do, and after we had WorldCom, Enron, Tyco, and we got Sarbanes-Oxley, they started saying, well, you got to have an ethics officer. And if you're going to really empower that person has to have some power, and they have to be part of the senior management. And whether or not corporations take this seriously is indicative of where they place that ethics officer. Are you just making your general counsel, for example, the ethics officer? A lot of places try to do that. The corporation that I worked for, they made me the ethics officer. We were a publicly traded company and I was the legal counsel. And because lawyers are governed by such a strict code of professional responsibility, a lot of people look at that and say, well, the lawyer will know what to do. The problem with that is that lawyers are there if they're not an ethics officer, if they're not an independent ethics officer, if they're there as the general counsel of the company to protect the company. That's their job. And that can conflict with telling your supervisor or the president or the board of directors that there's unethical behavior going about, right? So it's important that we empower employees. How do you do that? Well, by having open and honest methods of allowing for complaints and things like that that don't lead to retaliation, and that's hard to do. It's also formed by the virtues, habits, and character of the organization itself. And we talked about the idea that all organizations that are successful have a core set of values, but you don't have to have good values, right? So what does ethical leadership look like? Good leadership versus ethical leadership. And there is a difference. What's the difference? Well, you could define good leadership as being effective in terms of achieving the goals that the leader wants. But the problem with that is that, again, you could have unethical goals. And I asked, I think in a previous lecture, is it possible to pursue an irrational goal in a rational manner? And the answer is yes. You can pursue a completely irrational goal. And the classic example of this, of course, is Nazi Germany. The elimination of an entire subsect of people based on ethnic identity is pretty irrational. But if you're going to do it, they went about it in a perfectly rational way. And, I mean, if you, there's a fictionalized movie about this, about how they developed, the machine to do that, called The Exception. And it's a good movie. I think it's on Netflix. I think you can get it on Netflix. So good leadership is you're effective at getting people to follow you. That's not necessarily ethical leadership. And so what we want both good and ethical leadership. Well, what are the types of leadership that we can have? Well, there are different theories of leadership, and I've written a textbook on leadership in management. And we look at these different theories. So contingency theory, theory X and theory Y. So these are diametrically opposed theories in terms of a Hegelian dialectic. You have a thesis and an antithesis, right? So theory X says that people are basically sort of inherently lazy and that you need to monitor them closely, micromanage them, because if you don't, they're not going to perform. And we're going to talk about the meaning and value of work today, and whether or not you view work as something that is onerous and just something that you have to endure as a transactional relationship, a means to an end, will largely depend on whether or not you view things in terms of X and Y. Theory Y says that people want to work, they want to be productive, they find meaning and value in the activities that they do. One of the reasons I left the corporate world and came back to academia was because this is more meaningful. And I worked for a corporation that produced a product that I could be proud of. I was not working for Philip Morris, who manufactures cigarettes. I worked for a company that manufactured learning management systems for small school districts. We were the largest, we were the smallest of the large players in the LMS K-12 system, right? So we have an LMS here at UCO, it's called D2L. The LMS at the K-12 level is different than the LMS systems at the collegiate level, because what you have to do in those areas is we don't trust primary and secondary educators to provide the content. So you have to go through basically like the curriculum. So you have to provide all of the curriculum in the LMS. The way D2L works, I provide the curriculum. It's only a backbone for the material that I choose to put in it. But at the K-12 level, you have to put in assessment, testing, and content in order to be able to sell your LMS. And we were sort of the smallest of the big boy publishers that did that. And it was a good company, but looking at RFPs all day was not terribly satisfying. Now, one of my functional fictions is that I come down here and I teach classes and I transform, because the University of Central Oklahoma is committed to transformational education, that I transform you from, just somebody who doesn't know much about ethics into somebody who does know a lot about ethics and is probably going to go and hopefully leave this class and practice good ethical leadership in business. So I find meaning in that work. And so theory Y says, you should let employees flourish and grow. Now, what would be a synthesis model? Not all work can be meaningful. If you are working for McDonald's, you don't want creative employees. Do you? A Big Mac is 2 all beef patties, special sauce, lettuce, cheese, pickles, onions on a sesame seed bun. That is like forever and ever and ever. McDonald's had this ad, about the Big Mac. You don't want them getting creative with that. You just want them to take the bottom bun, put one of their small hamburger patties, not a quarter pounder, small hamburger patty on the special sauce, the pickles, the middle bun, the next hamburger patty, the lettuce, tomato, and the top bun with the sesame seed, right? You just want them to build the Big Mac according to the protocol. It's much easier to have meaningful work if you're not working at McDonald's or on an assembly line or things like that, if you're a college professor, right? So another theory is the dialogic, which is employee-centered leadership, the engagement of employees, the empowerment of employees. Now, a lot of times businesses will argue that this kind of leadership in business is not efficient. And that's true. Democracy, for example, is not an efficient form of government. What is the most efficient form of government?
Dictator.
It's a dictatorship. Yes, absolutely. I control the law. I say what the law is, and I carry out the law. I say, this is illegal. Having another party besides my party is not legal. We're going to outlaw it. If you start another party, you go to prison. We disappear you. That's efficient, isn't it? The way we don't actually have a pure democracy. We have a Republican form of government. And by Republican form, I mean, we have sort of our founding fathers had read, the discourses on the first 12 books of Titus Livy, and they understood what a Republican form of government is. And to understand a Republican form of government, you have to go back all the way to the ancients and look at what it meant to be a republic. In republic, Socrates lays out a form of government. You have a philosopher king, you have the guardians who are elements of aristocracy, and then you have elements of democracy and mass participation, right? That's what the Roman Republic was. You had consuls, you had the Senate, and then you had tribunes. That's not efficient. Having 435 members of the United States House is not, we are really not efficient right now. We're in the middle of a government shutdown because you got 535 members of Congress who have a different idea from what the executive wants. Yeah.
I don't want to take us too off topic, but what is a government shutdown? What are they doing?
Well, the government has to fund itself in various ways at the federal level. Historically, the way that has been done is every fiscal year, they passed a budget, which was this huge document that detailed all of the line items that we were going to purchase throughout the fiscal year, and Congress passed that. They have not done that, as far as I know, in years. So we've operated on continuing resolutions. So as the fiscal year ends, and it ends in October, the fiscal year at the federal level runs from October 1, I think, to September 30. As it ends, if you don't have a budget, you can't appropriate money, you can't spend money, and so the government shuts down.
To focus on that.
Well, in theory, they should be focused on that. It doesn't seem like they're focused on that.
In theory.
Because we're now in, I don't know what week of the government shutdown. Is this 3? It's 3? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're now in week 3 of the government shutdown. I have friends who are federal employees. They're not getting paid.
It depends on your funding. I have an internship at Tinker, and I'm still good because of our funding. for
Yeah,
now.
so that's
After
because
it's-
you're working for a contractor.
Capital funds.
You're not
I'm
working
working capital funds, different capital funds.
basically, there's no
Depends
money
on-
to fund the government. So as soon as they pass a continuing resolution, the government will, in theory, reopen and people will be paid and they'll go back to work. Now, there are positions that are considered mission critical,
Mhm.
and those are still working.
Right.
But they're not supposed to be engaged in new projects if they're working. They're just supposed to be keeping the wheels on.
So it's basically just like a catch up almost.
Yeah, so if they appropriate money and the government shutdown ends, then the government will reopen
Yeah.
and then you'll have to go forward.
Yeah.
From that point. So they have funded the government through continuing resolutions, as far as I know, for years now. They haven't actually solidified a budget in God, I don't know. It's when the last administration was that actually came up with a full-fledged budget, not just a continuing resolution. So that's not efficient. Dictatorships are the most efficient form. I say we're gonna spend money on this and that's what we spend the money on. I decide. Now, most of us don't want to live under that kind of leadership, but in a business, businesses will argue, business needs to be efficient. Unlike the government, which has the ability to raise money by forcing people to pay taxes, businesses don't have that luxury. And so they'll argue, like, we can't be employee-centered because we've got to make a profit. And if we're worried about workplace democracy, we're probably not being efficient. There's charismatic leadership. Now, charismatic and transformational leadership look a lot alike. And generally speaking, charismatic leadership is viewed as sort of pejorative of transformational leadership. The transformational leaders often are people that people like. They're attracted to them. Charismatic leaderships, people like them, but they could be manipulating people for an immoral cause, right? Transformational leadership focuses on not just the fact that the leader is popular or inspiring, but that he wants or she wants to take you to a better place, right? There's paternalistic leadership, the strong father model of leadership. This is one that, again, views employees in many instances as sort of needing to be micromanaged. Not all leaders come to the leadership position in the same way. And which model of leadership you use at a given entity or a given company will oftentimes depend on whether or not or how that leader is selected. In a very sort of culture of top-down management, you'll oftentimes find paternalistic leaders. In organizations that may be struggling, a lot of times you'll find pragmatic leadership. People are brought in or hired to solve a crisis. And they look at things in sort of putting out fires kind of way, right? And then there's caring leadership, where you focus again on the employee. And again, these kinds of leadership will oftentimes depend on the type of organization you have and whether or not you are facing a hostile sort of environment. If we think about it in terms of government agencies, one of the things that forever and ever they talked about in political science circles was something called the Iron Triangle. So the Iron Triangle is formed by an interest group that likes the bureaucracy, and then the interest group, the bureaucracy, and then outside, like organizations like business. And these form mutually symbiotic relationships between sort of oversight by congressional committees, interest groups, and business that all sort of benefit from the relationship. The classic example of an iron triangle is the military-industrial complex. You have big businesses that want to sell equipment to the military. You have the military that wants to buy big businesses stuff, and you have congressional committees that are supposed to provide oversight that are getting funding, right? You have to win elections. Elections cost a lot of money anymore because they're highly sophisticated. The average congressman has to raise millions and millions and millions of dollars to get reelected. And how often do they have to do that? How often are congressmen elected?
2 years?
Every 2 years, that's right. Every 2 years, they face the voters. Senators are elected for a term of 6 years. 1/3 approximately of the Senate is up for election every 2 years. So every 2 years, all the members of the House of Representatives have to go up for election. And what should be a situation in which you have oversight becomes one in which the oversight is very loose because you have these interest groups that are perpetuating sort of the system in mutually beneficial ways to sell things. Like, I mean, under the Reagan administration, one of the things that they identified as being wasteful was there was some organization that was spending $250 on a hammer. That sounds ridiculous. I did a study one time here, just an informal study when I was a political scientist, on how much it cost to change a light bulb. And this was 30 years ago when I first started teaching and I was a political scientist. It turns out at that time it took about $100 to change a light bulb in a classroom. If the light bulb goes out in here, can I just climb up on a ladder and change the light bulb? No. How do we get the light bulbs? Well, because at that time it was more than $1,000. We bid on them, which meant that you had purchasing involved, opening bids. You had to fill out work orders that went to an administrative assistant. The administrative assistant typed up the work order, then they submitted it through campus mail. When I first started teaching, we didn't have electronic delivery of the work orders, so they would send it through campus mail. There would be routing of that work order, then it would go to the physical plant. The work order department clerks would get it, they would look at it, process it, send somebody out to change the light bulb, and it cost about $100 to change a light bulb. So it really, it kind of depends on what kind of environment the organization is facing. If you're the military and you have this sort of iron triangle of people that are all sort of, mutually benefiting from something, you're going to face a far different environment than, say, the EPA, which has people that are interest groups that are actively hostile to the mission of the EPA because it creates regulations, right, that big business generally doesn't like. And then when they fall down, you have environmental groups that are equally as hostile to the EPA because they don't think the EPA is doing a very good job. So how do you build a value-based culture then, given the environmental constraints and context? Well, it starts with having a mission statement. What is the mission statement of the organization? Looking at that mission statement and then developing from that codes of ethics and statements of value, and actually going through and making sure that those have meaning to them. That they're not just things that we put on the wall and ignore. As an attorney, for example, I am governed by the rules of professional responsibility at all times. And it's not just something that I can ignore. If you ignore it, you can lose your license to practice law. The bar can take away your ability to practice law. So it has teeth to it. It has enforcement mechanisms that ensure that it's effective. It's harder to do that in organizations in which you don't have that kind of ability to enforce the rules maybe as much. And then it also requires that you monitor your workplace through audits, having ethics hotlines, having a corporate ethics officer who is part of the executive suite and has real power. How are you funding it? Are you giving that office? Are you providing them with the resources necessary to engage in monitoring? Is it just one person that has no support staff, no ability to investigate? Or do you take it seriously? And organizations that do this well have a holistic integration of this, where it becomes part of the culture, starting on day one with training. But you can't just train people once on this kind of stuff. It has to be a perpetual and continual monitoring of the mechanisms of ethics and compliance in the organization as a whole. And Sarbanes actually largely mandated that, but as time goes on, one of the things that happens is when we have these ethics scandals, like Enron, WorldCom, Tyco, and then the subprime mortgage industry and the failures of the banking system, people become very interested in ethics, and then we have a tendency to get amnesia and not remember these things and let them fall by the wayside as time progresses on. As a species, we're very susceptible to forgetting the lessons of history. The historian William Durant once said that the only lessons of history are that nobody ever remembers the lessons of history. An arresting concept for a historian to say. But we have a tendency to engage in similar behavior over and over and over again. And then we act surprised when we, don't come up with different results. But there are examples of companies that do this. Until recently, I would have said that Johnson & Johnson was one of those companies. I would have said that Southwest Airlines was one of those companies that really paid attention to employees, that listened to their employees. They're facing a hostile environment now because they're facing perhaps a corporate takeover and an insistence that they change. And Southwest is changing their model as a result of these outside external forces in the market that are buying up Southwest shares and forcing them to change their model. What was Southwest's model forever and ever and ever that set them apart, that made them different? It was open seating and bags fly free. They're now charging for bags and they're now assigning seats. They had already sort of started giving preference to the seating. One of the things that I did when I have a Southwest loyalty membership and I have a Southwest credit card, and I will always pay for the upgrade when they had open seating to be in A1 through 15, because if you're in A1 through 15, it almost ensures that you're going to get either the bulkhead or a window seat. And those are prime real estate on a plane that doesn't have a first class section, right? Because you have more space if you get that first row or an exit row seat on the plane. And they're facing this pressure, and we'll have to see if they continue to maintain sort of the high ethical standards that they've had for a long time. All right, the meaning and value of work. One of the previous editions of this, and this is very old now, but I still use it because I think it's one of the best examples. There was an NFL Cardinals football player who, after 9/11, decided to leave his lucrative contract in the NFL and go join the US Army. And he was ultimately killed in combat after 9/11. Why would anybody do that? Why would you leave this guaranteed, like if you are smart and you manage your contract well, and then you are smart with your money afterwards, you will never have to work. I mean, Tom Brady played for a long time as quarterback, but most players don't last that long. And Tom Brady has had a very successful career post playing football in being a commentator of football. Most players don't have that because most players are not as good as Tom Brady. Now, whether or not Tom Brady was ethical, I'm not sure. But he had a brilliant career. Maybe the greatest quarterback of all time. Arguably. Why would you give up this guaranteed, like millions of dollars perhaps, to go be a private in the United States Army where you're not making millions of dollars? Well, there had to be some higher calling that Tillman felt. And after 9/11, a lot of people felt that and went into the military, right? So one of the things that we look at as marketers is we recognize that one of the things that makes companies successful, if they have a strong corporate culture, is if they can get their employees to live the brand. Well, in order to get them to live the brand, you have to look at the jobs that they're doing and try to come up with, recognizing that the baggage handlers at Southwest are obviously, you got to stack bags in the plane and load it in a certain way. And you don't want them to get too creative in that way because you have to do a weight and balance on the plane. And so you're recognizing that, like there's science and physics involved here. You can't just throw the bags in any old way that you want. Planes have to be within the weight and balance. Even if they're within the weight, if you load them too far aft, for example, you run the risk of the aircraft stalling and killing everybody, on takeoff or landing. And so, but how did Southwest achieve this culture? Well, it largely depends on what your view of work is, right? So a lot of the literature on this, and one of the reasons that we're interested in this as marketers is even the baggage handlers at Southwest contribute in a meaningful way to the value that the airline provides. Getting your bags on the plane, in transit, switch to another plane, and ultimately to the destination is really important to most people, particularly to business travelers, which is what Southwest primarily targeted when they started out, was business travelers. Why is that really important? If you've got a business meeting and your luggage gets lost, you may not be appropriately dressed, which is one of the reasons that a lot of people do the whole carry-on. I really hate people who insist that they're going to carry on all of their luggage because they're constantly trying to shove a bag that's really too big into the overhead bins. My goal is to walk on an airplane with nothing but my phone. And people are like, well, they lose bags. They don't really lose bags anymore because it's all scanned and they put, barcodes on everything and it's tracked fairly well. So how do you do that? Well, if again, thinking about these leadership views, you view work simply as a transactional process, a means to an end, it's harder to do. In the 20th century, we had lots of these sort of views of work that were very pejorative. In a book called Working by Studs Terkel, he takes this view that it's primarily negative. It's something that we have to do just to get through the day, earn a living, and hopefully, at some point retire with some amount of dignity. But that it's hard, it's laborious, it's not fun, and largely that view is informed by the beginning of the 20th century and the Industrial Revolution, where we saw corporations really abusing their employees in terms of very bad working conditions, unsafe working conditions. If you got injured on the job, there was no sort of protection or workers' compensation, things like that. And it led to a lot of really, really bad results, right? So there's this view, if we look at it in terms of Hegelian, dialectic, which is the thesis is that working is something that is, hard, transactional. And then an antithesis would be that it has human fulfillment. The human fulfillment model of work. When we think about these two diametrically opposed views, one of the things that we can look at is a book called Habits of the Heart by Bella and his co-authors, in which he talks about sort of three different types of work that we can do. At the lowest level, and the reason that you are here on a Tuesday and listening to me drone on about ethics and workplace and how we become good marketers to our internal constituents as well as our external constituents and try to focus on employees is because you want something more than a job. A job is one in which your identity is completely divorced from the activity that you do to earn a living. I have served on the Guthrie City Council twice now for quite some time. The first time I ran for city council, I was 25. I was the youngest that you could be. That was the charter, required that you be 25 years of age in order to run for city council. I got a seat on the city council. I represented Ward 3. 25 years later, I represent Ward 3, and we've changed some, but at the time that I was on the council the first time and when I became vice mayor the first time, the city of Guthrie actually employed our trash collectors. They were city employees. And one of these city employees was one of my constituents. He lived in my ward. I knew him. We no longer do this. We now contract that out. We have outsourced that function. And why have we outsourced that function? Well, because it was cheaper to outsource the function. And one of the reasons that it's cheaper to outsource the function is that the benefits that we offer city employees cost a lot of money. Things like pension plan at the time cost a lot of money. And if you outsource that, you get away from that cost because the companies, the private companies like Laidlaw and Waste Connections that provide these don't provide those kinds of benefit-rich plans. They don't provide the health insurance that we provided to our employees in the city. But so we've gone from that to outsourcing it. But at the time, we actually employed our trash collectors in Guthrie. And one of them, I knew him, was a constituent of mine. And he was generally a happy guy. But if you asked him how he defined his life, he wouldn't say it's, I drive a trash truck for the city of Guthrie. It was by other things. The job that he did was completely divorced from the identity that he had. He would have told you about his family and hunting and fishing and other things that formed the core of his identity. It was merely a way of making a living. Now, next week, you're gonna start writing an essay, and as I start to read those essays, I'll probably wish that I were, a trash collector because that's kind of mindless. And it's not a bad job anymore. At the time, when I was 25, if you worked in waste management, there were 3 positions on a trash truck. There's only 1 now. At that point in time, they actually had 2 guys that rode on the back of the truck. The prime position on the crew was to be the driver, because all the driver did was drive. But if you were on the back of the truck, you actually had to go pick up the trash cans, empty them into the back of the truck, and then put them back. That's no longer the way it works. The trash truck pulls up and it grabs Big Blue or whatever it is that the city has. In Guthrie, they're green, they're not Big Blue, but the city of Oklahoma City has blue ones. They call them Big Blue, and it grabs it and picks it up. And I think that's not necessarily a bad job anymore, to just ride around and pick up, trash cans and not have to read students' essays. I'm joking. But I mean, if you have that job, you're not telling people at the bar that, you're not bragging about the job. Very necessary job. I'm not making fun of the job. I'm just saying you're gonna define your life by something other than that job. What most of you want, and the reason that you're here, is you want a career. A career is one in which there is a close connection between the identity that you have and the action that you perform in order to earn a living. There is some panache. Now, I view my life as an attorney as a calling in which there is no distinction between the activity performed and the self. I am an attorney 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, subject to the bar regulations at all times. And that will be the case until I either die or I give up my license to practice law. Most of you don't view your job that way, but you do want this close connection between the activity that you're performing and the job and the self, right? There's some panache to, when you strike up a conversation with somebody at a fashionable party to say I'm a college professor. That's not something that everybody says. Now, it sort of depends. My mother, who was an English teacher, said that it was horrible being an English teacher because at cocktail parties and stuff like that, the first question people will ask you is, what do you do? And I'm going to tell you, they ask you that question not because they care about you. It's because it instantly pegs you on a social hierarchy. And it also gives them something to talk about. And it's a segue into talking about themselves, to ask you what you do. It seems like they're interested, but it's oh, by the way, I'm an attorney, right? It's a way of doing that. But my mother said that being an English teacher was horrible because at cocktail parties and things like that, people will say, what do you do? And she'd say, I'm an English teacher. And they'd say, I hated English in high school, and walk away. It's a little bit different, if you say I'm a marketing professor, they're like, oh, really? They don't instantly have this. If you say you're a math professor, I think it's probably the same thing. It's like, I hated math in high school. I couldn't stand algebra. But marketing, it's like, that's kind of interesting. You do advertising. I'm like, not really, but okay, yeah. I mean, they have some connection. So you want a career. So what is the value of work? Well, if you want a career, there's obviously the instrumental things, the wages, the benefits that you're going to get, health, disability, leave, a 401k. But there's also these psychic goods that come with having a career. Satisfaction at doing a job well, at executing something, at coming up with a marketing plan that lead to self-worth, ideas of achievement and self-esteem, and happiness. And by happiness, we don't just mean, sort of the drink up, let's have another round. It's also about finding creative expression and contentment in your job. So as I said, we have these conventional views of work where it's negative, it's repetitive, it's transactional, versus the hedonist or the human fulfillment model, which says that work can be, if you're an attorney, one of the things that you can find great satisfaction in, and I find great satisfaction in being an attorney, is that the cases that I take, I make an impact in people's lives, right? So you've got these diametrically opposed models, and largely it depends on whether or not you have the trash collector job versus the attorney job, right? But is there some synthesis model that we can come up with, which is what we might call the liberal model of work? So between these two, so you have a thesis, an antithesis, and then they'll combine into a synthesis, which is the liberal model. So what does the liberal model of work say? What is an ethical workplace? Recognizing that there are some people that are going to have to load the plane, right? And you don't want them to be terribly creative in the loading of the plane because you gotta do the weight and balance, and you gotta make sure that the bags are proportionately, on the center of gravity or forward of the center of gravity as opposed to after the center of gravity. I would suggest to you that even the pilots, you don't really want, that's a job that requires a lot more skill than baggage handler. But I would suggest to you that you probably don't want creative pilots in the cockpit. I hold a commercial pilot's license. You don't really want a whole lot of creativity there. Like, let's try parabolic dives. How do we simulate? How does NASA simulate weightlessness? It's parabolic dives. But they take you up in an airplane and they shoot it straight up and then dive. And you can find videos of pilots doing this to their insignificant others in the back on YouTube. My nephew wants us to try this with his sister because she's forever taking off her seatbelt and laying across the back seat of the plane. And he's just absolutely adamant that we need to try this, where you just raise the nose and then dive sharply and watch as they go. You can find these videos on YouTube, right? You can find videos of they call it the vomit rocket. For
I think there was a
NASA.
company that did it like commercially.
Huh?
I said, I think there was a company that did it commercially.
There
Like,
probably
You could
is.
buy tickets and like.
Yeah, and do it, yeah, so that you can experience weightlessness. I think in fact, there was a Big Bang Theory where they did this. They went on a commercial flight that does this. So what is the liberal model then of work? Well, recognizing that you don't want pilots who are doing, you don't want Southwest Airlines pilots doing this. And with modern technology, ADS-B and things like that, we can tell if they're doing this, right? If they're, sort of flying erratically. Well, it's the Norman Bowie model. It's a model that focuses on freedom of choice, recognizing that not everybody's gonna have these jobs. Even pilots at Southwest don't necessarily have jobs where, you're creative and figuring things out. It is about strategy and planning for the flight, but it's within very well-defined constraints, right? So what is it that we can do to make an ethical workplace? Well, we can focus on, first of all, rights and duties of employees. And with regard to rights, it's things like autonomy, respect, offering fair pay for the labor that is put into it. And that's one of the things that in America, maybe we don't do really, really well. We don't respect maybe the value of the employees as much as they do in other countries. So for example, when I was a foreign exchange student in Germany, teachers are actually paid pretty well in Germany compared to the United States, where we have a tendency to maybe not pay them so well, right? So looking at those kinds of things, what is fair pay for the amount of education and skill level involved? What kinds of things do we have a duty as employers to do? Well, it's respecting employees, taking into consideration health and safety concerns. It's the Johnson & Johnson credo. We have to provide for lean times. We have to appreciate the property that we have the privilege of managing and the employees that work for us, the doctors, the patients, the physicians, the community as a whole. It's recognizing that you have to think about these things. Not everybody's going to have a meaningful job, but they should have the right to make free and autonomous choices regarding those jobs and have some amount of dignity and participation rights. That doesn't mean that you have all of it. So what does a workplace that's fair and balanced look like? Well, it's one that focuses on sort of a limited model of at least due process. So what is a limited model of due process? And businesses, of course, will argue that due process is costly and that we shouldn't necessarily engage in it. But Southwest, again, if you look at the early days of Southwest and the founder's model, which is if you treat your employees right, they'll treat the customers right, and people will ultimately want to do business with you. Southwest, for a long period of time, was probably the most successful airline in the United States. It certainly was the only one that had never gone through bankruptcy and had the longest history of being profitable in an industry in which profit margins are notoriously thin. And why is that? Well, they focus on things like participation rights and due process rights. So what does due process look like in a workplace? Well, obviously, the more severe the consequences are, the more due process you want. So what does due process mean? If I were to accuse you, for example, of cheating on an assignment, what would you want in terms of being able to defend yourself, having a fair and equitable system? Let's say I accuse you of cheating. Should I be able to tell the conduct officer, throw him out? Can I do that?
You can. Can you?
Well, does the conduct officer have to listen to me? By the way, I used to supervise the conduct officer here at UCO when I was Associate General Counsel. Does the conduct officer have to no? The reason we have a conduct officer is so that what? It's not just up to me. I can't just throw you out and have it posted to your transcript. Right? You have this person who is supposed to hear both sides. And if you want, you can file a grievance. You can file a grade appeal. If I accuse you of cheating and give you an F in the class, you can appeal that. What do you want in terms of that appeal? Should it just be to me? Should we just let you go to the department chair? I used to be the department chair. Are you gonna get a fair hearing if you just go to the department? Part of the process, by the way, is it involves coming to me, talking to me, then going and talking to the department chair. Are you gonna get much satisfaction out of the department chair?
I doubt it.
How are department chairs chosen? Anybody know? We're elected
By the professors.
by the professors in the department. Does that present a problem for you if you're complaining about a faculty member who has the ability to vote on whether or not you stay in your office?
It depends if that person voted. If that person voted against you, the department chair might be a sympathetic ear. If they don't like them.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, how many votes are in the marketing department? We're down 3 faculty members right now. So at one time we had 12 faculty members. You know, every vote counts when you only have 12, doesn't it? Some departments have, there used to be a department called Creative Studies. They had like 5 faculty members. Every vote really counts in that department, right? So, well, what is the heart of due process? It's notice, the ability to be told what it is you're accused of, and hearing. Now, the more severe the penalty, the more hearing you want. Before we throw you out of off campus and before we say that you are expelled, and in theory, expulsion is permanent, although nothing's ever permanent, really. You should have a hearing before a conduct committee. Who makes up the committee? Well, it's faculty and students. Why is that? The idea is that if we had all faculty, the faculty will naturally probably support the faculty member. It's not faculty from your department that hear these things. They can't have a connection to any of the parties. It's not students that are in class with you, right? Now, I will tell you that in my experience of having supervised those committees for a number of years, when I was in the Office of Legal Counsel, faculty members are always harder on faculty members. And students are always harder on students. I can remember lots of grade appeal committees where the students were like, hang 'em!
Where do they get these students from? Like, how do they choose?
So you're nominated, usually they send out the conduct committee chair, or the conduct committee, the conduct officer sends out nominations to the dean's offices, and the dean's offices nominate students for these various roles. And you have to go through training. Most students don't want to sit on them because it involves, we don't just like throw you on a committee. You're like told what the process is and how the procedures work and things like that. So the more severe the penalty, like there's a big difference between just giving you an F, right? If I accuse you of cheating and throwing you off campus. The more severe the penalty, the more due process you want, the more kinds of safeguards in the hearing that you want. Initially, grades are determined by a faculty member. But if you're not happy with that grade and you think that I did something unfairly, you should be able to appeal that grade. And that goes through these steps, right? And the more severe the grade, the more steps you have, right? If you get a failing grade, you should be able to, go through a committee and have students and faculty hear it and ultimately determine whether or not I gave you the appropriate grade based on objective criterion that are established in things like the syllabus. And I did see when I held this job, I did see quite a few faculty members who lost grade appeals, and they always lost the grade appeals if they violated their syllabus. Or if they didn't have a very good syllabus that said, these are the ways that you're evaluated in this class. If it seemed to be arbitrary and capricious and an abuse of discretion. All right, any questions about that? So next week you have the exam. It's open. It will be open on Tuesday. You have a week to complete it. If you have any questions about it, you're welcome to email, call, text me if you got ducks.
It's in the testing center.